so excited to be here today. Great turnout. Thank you for coming because we've got a great speaker for you. Nomi Prins is a well-known financial author and writer, and I think you're going to be very excited with what she has to tell you today. First, a couple of housekeeping items. Note, she will be signing copies of her book, All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. Following this address at 2 o'clock at the main stage, people can purchase a copy of the book here, $18 for members, $20 for non-members, so just buy a membership and get a couple bucks off. And then members are also invited to join Nomi at the member social at 3 p.m. in the Forest Tent. We'll be serving homemade pizza baked in our cob oven. But I think you all know, since you're here, that we are honored to have Nomi Prins here today. She is a brave voice out there, brave enough to expose the dangers of rampant financial capitalism that really are destructive to our public welfare. And this is something that I think folks in this tent know, but Nomi can give us the details on. This practice of privatizing profits and socializing losses doesn't just happen in the utility industry, which I think in a regulated utility environment we understand. But Nomi was at Goldman Sachs during the rise of Enron, so we'll also hopefully hear something of the pitfalls of a deregulated environment. We need effective regulation. But in case you don't know, Ms. Prins is widely sought after for a unique perspective on politics, finance, and the economy. She's the author of the recent All the President's Bankers, we just noted. And her other acclaimed books include It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bonuses, Bailouts, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. That's a great one. I worked in the financial industry during the latest collapse, and I really think everyone needs to be educated on what really happened and what didn't happen, which was any repercussions for the folks who stole money and for that whole sort of disgusting array. Another great book she wrote is Other People's Money, The Corrupt Mugging of America, kind of a theme, which predicted the current financial crisis and was chosen as the best book of 2004 by the Economist, Barron, and the Library Journal. She has appeared on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, C-SPAN, Democracy Now!, Fox, and PBS, as well as numerous radio shows, including some that I listen to, like NPR and Canadian programming. So today she's going to talk to us about how the financial system benefits those in power and the possibilities of public banking, and how regulation, I would add effective regulation, can help push forward policies that benefit the public, including relevant information on campaign finance and energy policy. So without further ado, Nomi Prins.
Everybody hear me okay? Yes, I hear it echoing. That's good. It's an echo tab. No, you can't hear me. I should be louder. The mic should be up and I should be louder. Okay. I hear that coming back to me more. Is that better? No. Is a little more? 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 Is my spinal tap, right. It's in my hair. Okay. Anyway, try that again. Thank you very much. You guys, this whole atmosphere is so energetic. It is so positive. I mean, the one area almost in everything I look at or have looked at since I worked on Wall Street, since I left, since I was excommunicated by many people as well, including, by the way, Fox recently, but that's like a whole other story. You can ask me later. I'm sure that's not really top on the list of things to talk about. But I know, and what's so great is that the elements of clean energy, of sustainable energy, of a renewable energy policy and work that people are doing from on the ground is really one of the main points of light and positivity in what is so wrong on so many levels throughout so many industries that are effectively powered by the financial sector, which I'm going to get into in a big way. I'm also going to take you through a lot of American history from my last book, but also because the intersection of politics and finance also has a very strong through line with energy and energy policy and oil and the concepts of what national security should be and what it can be. And so there's a lot of combinations and connections that come through when you look at some of the individuals and their families that were involved in building the country over the last century plus, and being head of their institutions, in particular the largest banks in this country, how they've survived, why they've survived, who they've been friends with. And so I want to go a little bit into that history because it's fascinating. One of our former presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a wilderness guy, as well as the president, he said, and this was in the early 1900s, so over 100 and something years ago, he said that our country is great because of the lavish use of our resources, but it's time to seriously inquire as to what will happen when the forests are gone, when the oil, the coal, the iron, and the gas are exhausted. Now, he said this over 100 years ago. And a lot of stuff happened to deplete and to utilize a lot of those resources in some very negative ways since then. But one of the things he also started, and this was where relationships come in, was busting the trusts. And what trusts were back in the day, where they were collections, not like co-ops, where they're collections of like individual farmers coming together and putting their produce together and having that, say, get used and sold by people in the community or in the larger community. It was basically companies that controlled money and that had leaders who were the elite members of American society. And in some cases had very strong connections to European and British society, but for the most part were the pillars, the robber barons of American society. And what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do was effectively to take away power from the most powerful institutions that were involved in the infrastructure building of the country and dilute it and bust it. And he was known as that great trust buster. And one of the companies he most went after was a company called Standard Oil, right? And Standard Oil was a Rockefeller company. It was run by the Rockefeller brothers, John D. Rockefeller and his brother William. And they basically had this monopoly on oil and also on the capital, on the money that was coming from the oil industry. And that's one of the places that Teddy Roosevelt went after to bust. But what Teddy Roosevelt left open, and where bankers came into the whole equation, including the Rockefellers, was he never busted banks. Right? And the reason, and there's a long century of reason, why he and subsequent presidents did not bust banks, did not ever, with the exception of his cousin, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, which I will get to, who did bust the banks. Besides that, no other president really did that. They did the opposite. And the reason Teddy Roosevelt did the opposite, even though that wasn't his platform, was because there was a big panic in New York that started, as they do, on Wall Street. Right? So there was a panic in 1907, almost 100 years before the financial crisis of 2008. And in that panic, what happened was the smaller banks were starting to go under. Some of the other banks were taking bets on the steel industry as it happened, and those bets went wrong. And when those bets went wrong, those companies started to create this whole confidence run in New York. But back then, they also had the money, the deposits of savers in New York, and the smaller banks had the smaller savers' money. And this was of concern to New Yorkers. So they started, there was a bank called Knickerbocker Trust. It was a bank, and it had a lot of problems because of what happened in steel bets gone wrong and the confidence gone away. All throughout New York, you had people running at the bank, coming to the doors. You had fights between the police officers with the clubs at the time, trying to keep back these people because when things started to go sour, they had no recourse to how to get back their money. There was no FDIC. There was no ability to insure their deposits. So if a bank went under, all of their savings was gone. This upset people, right? So they were basically angry, scared, in front of these doors. Teddy Roosevelt, at this point, he's in Washington, and he's concerned. You know, no one wants a financial crisis on their watch, and a big panic. And there had been a series of panics actually before that. So this was kind of coming from a position of some of the banks and some of the bets going very wrong again. But what he did, because of his fear, was he went to a big banker at the time who was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was like the rival of John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was making money in the oil business and trying to get into the finance business. JP Morgan only made money in the finance business through relationships with Europe and through what was happening in the US. So he said to Teddy Roosevelt, I got this. I will sort it out. I just need $25 million from the Treasury Department. First US bailout, right? So he said, I want $25 million and I'll sort it out. So what Teddy Roosevelt does, because again, he's not a finance guy. He was a businessman, he was a wilderness guy, he didn't like the idea of too much power concentrated in the hands of too few companies, but he didn't quite get the power, and it was nascent at the time of finance. So he said, okay, fine. Got the $25 million from the Treasury Department. JP Morgan got all these friends of his huddled in one of his libraries in New York City, and he said, here's what we're gonna do. We're not gonna save Knickerbocker Trust. I don't like those guys, I don't know those guys, they're small potatoes, no. But I wanna make sure we save our friends in case there's any knock-on problems. Does this sound familiar? We wanna save our friends. So there's a company called the American Trust Company. He says, we'll save them because I got some interest in their stock. I kind of know them. We hang out together. We'll save them. And I'm going to take the $25 million. I'm not actually going to use that. I'm going to put that away in case I need to lend it out later and make interest on it to anybody else who's failing. So he basically took the Treasury's money, put it aside, and said, I'll sort of pay it out later as it comes. And he got his friends to pony up $5 million each from their banks that were sitting in that room. So he put no money on the table. This is important because he put none of his own or his company's money on the table. He was just the guy, right? Things do settle. And not only do things settle because some of the smaller banks go under, the bigger banks look like they're solvent. They tell the public they're solvent. The New York Times basically calls JP Morgan the king of the world in a headline. Because he saved New York, he saved the country, he saved the farmers. Because at the time, the first thing that happened, and what tended to happen in the next crisis, in the 1929 crash, was that it was the Western farmers and the Western banks and the Western communities that stopped receiving loans from the big New York-centric banks when things went wrong. When things go wrong, then credit tightens up, liquidity as they call it, the looseness of money becomes dead, and people that need it most receive it least. And that was happening back then. But the glorification of JP Morgan did something else. It allowed him to really consolidate the whole power of banking and financial capitalism from his own power base. And that's what he began to do. He sponsored a meeting. And this is where families start to get even more connected into the saga of getting from finance and politics through energy. He organized a meeting with some people and a senator called Senator Nelson Aldrich. Again, I'm giving you a lot of history. I will not quiz you on these names, but I'm going to throw out a few important names. They're in the book, and they're important to everything that's happened since. Nelson Aldrich was a senator from Rhode Island who had these aspirations of being very in the thick of the blue blood, big family, rich, wealthy kind of establishment. And he was already in the establishment. He was on the Senate Finance Committee. So he was already on the committee in Washington that took care of the money in the turn of the century after this panic. And Morgan and him had a conversation and said, look, in case this happens again, in case someone bets wrong and everything falls apart, whether it is on steel or whatever, I need to be protected. I don't actually trust the Treasury Department. Yes, I got $25 million this time, but what happens if they can't give it to me? I don't want to be responsible, more or less. So Nelson Aldrich writes some acts. He talks to some presidents. Taft came in as president after that. And he says, all right, well, that was where he decided to work with some bankers to create the Federal Reserve. Right? And the Federal Reserve came out of the fear, not that the country had, but that the bankers had, that they would not be able to capitalize or have the money for themselves later if things went really, really bad. Yes, they could get it from the government, but maybe they could also get it from somewhere else. Nelson Aldrich did something else besides sponsor a meeting in 1910 in Jekyll Island, which is off the East Coast. I actually went there to do some research for the book. It's now a hotel. But Jekyll Island used to have a club for all the rich establishment individuals on it, and the membership in that club was more than, I don't know, the $50 it is to be a member of the MREA, which I'm going to do after this. But thank you. But it was a place where they went. They kind of would go with their families over the holidays. They'd deposit their wives kind of and kids, and they would sort of meet in these rooms and smoke and stuff and talk about the world and how to cut it up. But in this particular year, J.P. Morgan did not go to a meeting that happened on Jekyll Island. He sponsored it. He had the club membership. He sent some lieutenants from his bank, from what is now Citigroup, but was then National Citibank, it was called, James Stillman, and a bunch of other people. James Stillman is another name you will never hear of, but I'm going to throw it out because it relates to this whole story. And he said, I'm not going to be there, but you guys sort this out. And they did. They spent Thanksgiving, which was before all the families came each year to do their Christmas and New Year holidays. It was very quiet on the island, and all these posters went up around the island, and they're all in the museum there. And it was like, don't go near this area, and make sure. It was all very quiet, even though there was no way in and out of this area besides through large boat. But they still kind of really closed it off. And there they sat about creating legislation. Now, the person that was not also involved in this meeting was Nelson's nephew. Third of 5 names you'll never have heard of, but I'm going to throw out. His name was Winthrop Aldrich. Winthrop had a nice little place on Madison Avenue in New York, really swanky back then, 60th and Madison. And Nelson was going to get Winthrop to sort of be involved, and he went to visit Winthrop before the meeting, but he got hit by a trolley car. Nelson did. Winthrop was fine. Nelson got hit by this trolley car, so by the time he made it to Jekyll Island, he actually wasn't doing that great. So when they got off the 10 days at Jekyll Island, the 2 people that presented the policies they discussed to create the Federal Reserve were 2 bankers. One of which was James Stillman, another one of which was Frank Vanderslip. They both became part of what we now know as Citigroup, which was the National Citibank. They went to Washington, they presented this plan. It took a few years for this plan to get through. It didn't get through until we had a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. And under Wilson, it was passed in December 1913 to become the Federal Reserve. Why is that important? Because it became an institution in Washington that was theoretically independent of politics and of bankers, but that was actually created by the conversations of private bankers, but was sold to the public by Wilson as something that would help the public, and specifically help the farmers when there were times where credit was bad because crises were occurring. And that's how it got sold. Throughout the years, it's been used to raise and lower interest rates. It's been also called in to do that very thing that J.P. Morgan was scared of, which is bail out or help the largest financial institutions when things go wrong, which is what we saw in the crisis of 2008. But through the period after the Federal Reserve was created, we had another crisis, and that was the crash in 1929. Now, the crash in 1929 happened for a lot of reasons, but mostly because, again, there were bets on things that weren't realistic. There was fictitious presentations of securities and of other kinds of trusts and all of this stuff that was supposed to make people a ton of money, and that was not true, and that was fraudulent, and people just got a little bit ahead of themselves, a lot ahead of themselves. Who was scared again most? It was the bankers. So the 6 biggest banks we have today had ancestors that met in a room across from the stock exchange off Wall Street in 1929 when the markets first started to tank, and they were scared. And 6 of them got together. One of them was James Stillman. There was a bunch of other people there. One was Thomas Lamont. He was representing J.P. Morgan, who at this point had died, and his son Jack was running the Morgan Bank. And Jack was in London doing whatever. He wasn't there when this all happened, so Tom Lamont was his person. And a man named Al Wiggins, who was the head of Chase at the time. All these banks that you know of, Chase, Morgan, now that is J.P. Morgan Chase. James Stillman, National Citibank, that is now Citigroup. Morgan Stanley became an offshoot of the Morgan Bank. All of the bankers that were together in that room in 1929, and that had some friendships before that, even back to the panic and with Teddy Roosevelt, were very concerned about themselves. And they did the same thing. They said, if we could just put money into the market, make the markets go up, everything will be fine, confidence will be restored, it'll all be okay. But it wasn't okay. Right? We had a Great Depression, we had breadlines, we had 25% unemployment, we had massive foreclosures, we had problems throughout the farmland, throughout the West, and so forth. And so when FDR came into power, he said, this can't work. These people created then, as they have recently, the very securities, the very lies, the very fraud that tanked the markets and therefore the economy in 1929. Something has to be done to stop them. And he ran on the platform of basically being that populist, that progressive president who would change things. And he did change a lot of things. And one thing that he changed was the power of those banks. And he wrote, he didn't write, he signed an act called the Glass-Steagall Act. And what the Glass-Steagall Act did was it separated the functionality of these banks. So a bank could no longer take people's deposits and give regular people and small businesses loans and create weirdo securities that it could sell throughout the world and tank the market with when they went wrong. They just couldn't do both, which is it makes sense. It makes sense for stability. But here's the interesting thing that I did not know until I actually did the research at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, which was very close to where I grew up and never, analyzed this stuff when I was a kid. In fact, my first kind of thing I analyzed was water that I as a science project in the 5th grade, and I spoke about this on the webinar we had about this event beforehand. But I did this project called Water Troubles when I was 10. And the whole thing for the science fair was that I basically collected these different kinds of water and petri dishes and figured out which kind of water from which place had the most bacteria or whatever it was at the time, PCPs. There was issues with the river near the Hudson River and so forth near it. And then I sort of looked at a carbon filter for them, very rudimentary when I was 10. And I was really psyched about this project because I thought it was really cool. And I didn't win the science fair in my elementary school. This guy named Josh Komenica won. He was his father was a doctor. They did this whole thing of the nucleus and the atom and all these things that were all really intense. And I had my little bubble letters on my chart, water troubles, snow, river, rain. But it was cool because I actually got into the Dutchess County Science Fair. No, the Dutchess County Actual Fair. And I actually won the Environmental Award. So I thought that was way cooler than winning. So that was cool. Not too far away from FDR's library. Major segue there, but I wanted to share that with you because I couldn't share that with any other audience but you guys. You would appreciate that, so thank you. So one of the things I found out in FDR's library, and this is where there's some hope in this story, even though a lot of things have gone wrong since, is that it was actually two bankers that ran two of the three largest banks at that time, now two of the six largest banks in the States, Winthrop Aldrich, who I mentioned before, who was running Chase, and James Stillman, actually James Perkins, but they were associated. And they basically said to FDR before Glass-Steagall was passed, so before the banks were separated into normal activity and abnormal, complex, risky activity, is they basically said, we will separate our own banks. And Winthrop was very much key to this because he said, you know what, I get it. There are depositors here, and I would like to be the bank that depositors have confidence with. He had a business reason as well. And things were quite shaky around the thing. But he said, I will get this. I will go into Congress. I will talk to senators. And actually, there's a lot of letters between FDR and Winthrop Aldrich behind the scenes where FDR basically gave the responsibility of enhancing the Glass-Steagall Act from what it would have been initially, which was actually much weaker than what it became, to being a stronger version of itself. And what Winthrop did was he took out an ad in the front, an article in the front page of the New York Times as well. But that article, and this was before Glass-Steagall passed in June 1933. So a couple months before that, he had an article that said, Chase is separating its bank, and it had his, it was kind of black and white photo and so forth, and what he was doing and why he thought that was important. James Perkins, who worked with the Stillmans, did the same. He told his board of directors, we're going to do this. It took a year to actually complete the separation of the bank itself, but the announcement came before. And I'm reading this, it's like, to hear these two very established, very, wealthy, very, connected bankers. Winthrop's walking in and out of the Senate, he's hanging out with FDR, they yacht together. Winthrop was a big sailor, FDR was a big sailor, their kids, everything. And he was basically going against what would be called self-interest today of these bankers and saying, look, I will split up my bank. And also he said, and FDR said, it doesn't even make sense to establish insurance, which was also part of what happened after Glass-Steagall was passed in 1933. The FDIC was created, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to insure the deposits of people, so that there wouldn't have to be runs, that the government would actually have the backs of depositors. That didn't make sense to do if a bank could use that insurance to go and do stupid things that were really risky. So the sensibility of the whole thing was about, sustaining the economic stability of what was going on in the country and actually making sure that people had some confidence in the U.S.'s own banking system. And it wound up working very well, because for decades following the Glass-Steagall Act being passed, there weren't any real panics and there weren't any real crises. There was growth. There was World War II over in Europe, and a lot of the bankers in the United States worked together with the government to finance elements of that war. There was some, it's a whole other segue I won't get into, but there was some separation on Wall Street as to which banks supported the Allies versus which banks supported the Axis. That's a whole other topic for another point. But the fact is they worked with the government and they worked with the individuals of the country for a number of decades, because they didn't have the option of making money or doing anything really weird to make money that would destabilize that relationship. And that was during the time, though, when something else happened. So after World War II in the 1950s, they were involved in some of the infrastructure building in this country. And this is where sort of gas and oil and those kinds of things come more into play. Now, remember, we had Standard Oil, we had the Rockefellers go away. Now, they didn't really go away. Nelson Aldrich had a daughter named Abby. And Abby married John D. Rockefeller's son. Okay, so a good way of the elite back in the day to ensure their control over their castles was to intermarry. And they did. So the Aldriches and the Rockefellers combined. David Rockefeller, who today is like the oldest living member of the Rockefellers that ran Chase, was the son of that union. So Winthrop became David's uncle. And Nelson Rockefeller, who became the governor of New York and the vice president of the United States under Nixon, was his brother. So a lot of what started to happen because of marriages in the early part of the century started to come into play in politics and in banking throughout the middle part of the century. So while the US was growing, and while bankers were somewhat being responsible to that message and being aligned with the presidents and what was going on politically, there was also all these family arrangements that were running the financial institutions. And those people started changing. Winthrop Aldrich had been the guy who separated his bank. He had seen the Great Depression. He had helped to fund the Allies in World War II. He became the ambassador to the UK under President Eisenhower in the 50s. So he had a very strong public sense. Now you cannot imagine, I can't, Jamie Dimon, who is now the head of Chase, like being our ambassador to anything, right? I mean, and you can't imagine him being like, I will separate my bank, I'm gonna be a leader here. And do this, because that doesn't happen. He has done in many, many cases the opposite. He has talked about the need for more deregulation in banking rather than less, and we already have very little, as we've just seen, that's useful. But these people were a little bit different. But when the mantle went from Winthrop and sort of that group of people to David Rockefeller and to the individuals that were running banks in the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s, something happened. And they discovered oil. And they decided, and they began cultivating a very close relationship with some of the Arabic nations that were now producing oil. Now, in the 50s, the United States used or was connected or produced to 62% of the world's oil, even though they only had 7% of the world's population. So there was a tremendous amount of power that was connected to financing and relationships globally, even with a few amount of people. Some of those actual individuals were David Rockefeller and a man named John McCloy, last name. John McCloy was a lawyer for the Seven Sisters oil companies. He was also involved in 6 different presidential administrations, Democrat and Republican, from FDR on, in different capacities. He also was the chairman of Chase in the 50s, before David Rockefeller ultimately became the chairman of Chase. He had very strong relationships to the Arabic nations and the oil companies here. So he very much had their interests in mind. And he also was the second president of the World Bank. I'm throwing a lot of history at you. I'm trying to condense it, but this is where I get international. It's fun. So the World Bank is a level above the Fed in that it is the institution that was created in the wake of World War II, along with the IMF, to effectively allocate money from governments and with some private help as well to different infrastructure projects throughout the world. And the idea when the World Bank was created in the wake of World War II and the IMF was created was that these institutions would basically galvanize that finance, and they would find out and they would allocate it to developing countries. And they would choose infrastructures, and they could be as small as cleaning water to building highways to building bridges. There was very many levels that they could do. And in return for doing that, they tended to extract, again, other topic, but they tended to extract ways that these countries or these communities would have to behave in order to get that funding. So there was a price to be paid for that funding on the local level. But on the international level, it was another arm, effectively the United States and Europe, who tended to be the people deciding the allocation of those funds, which countries it would go to, what it would be used to do. John McCloy, who then became the head of Chase, the largest private bank in the country, was the second president of the World Bank between 1947 and 1949. In that capacity, he did something that changed the nature of how those development banks work. He said, in order for there to be more funding than what individual governments will give you to pay for infrastructure and development across the world, we need to sell bonds on Wall Street. And as we need to raise the money on Wall Street in order for there to be enough money to do what it is we need to do. And his requirement to President Harry Truman, when asked to take this post, his requirement to taking the post was he had to have 3 guys from Wall Street be his number 2 and number 3. So that was something he required, and he also required that the very nature of the World Bank allow Wall Street to have an opinion, and the language wasn't exactly like this, but to have an opinion on what the World Bank could decide to do. So even though this was a supranational, international organization, it had a very strong tie to Wall Street. If Wall Street couldn't raise the money in its investor community to pay for a bridge in Somalia or whatever, it wasn't going to happen. And so that's basically how a lot of what happened after the war got dictated by Wall Street way, way, way behind the scenes. Now, John McCloy was only there for 2 years and then became the head of Chase. While he was the head of Chase, Winthrop Aldrich, the old head of Chase, was making relationships in the Middle East, and predominantly oil relationships that were also connected to John McCloy, who was a lawyer for the major oil companies in the United States. Then David Rockefeller comes into play. He's rising through the company. He wants to be the head of Chase. He decides that the best way to do that is to be the international face of Chase. Forget what Chase is actually doing in the United States. We've got this. It's confident. It's solid. They're growing in depositors. Let's go international. And where do they have the most ability to go to the middle and differentiate themselves from the other big banks also trying to do the same thing and be competing with them is to go to the Middle East. And that's what he used to do. He and McCloy would go in and out of different meetings with different shahs and so forth in the Middle East to work on arrangements for financing elements of their oil industry that were really outside of the realm of what was happening on sort of a political international basis. And that's how the sort of Chase got involved in the oil industry, to the extent that when we had the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, it was to David Rockefeller that Jimmy Carter made the phone call to say, can you kind of help the situation? Not within Iran, but because he had been friends with the Shah of Iran, who had been excommunicated from Iran, which was part of the reason the whole thing happened. Again, I'm summarizing. But when I looked at the documents in the Carter Library for what actually happened, and you may have seen the Ben Affleck movie of kind of the fictionalized version of some of what happened during that hostage crisis. It was to David Rockefeller, this private citizen, head of a bank, with no official public position, not even as an advisor to the president officially, was asked in internal documents to see if there was anything he could do. It's a longer story because he was involved in sort of making that whole situation worse than it was, but he didn't do anything. And nor could he do anything. But that was also around the time where oil prices before that had spiked quite considerably in addition to the other instability that was going on from the Middle East. But he and other bankers didn't mind that. Because at this point, in the 70s, the bankers had started, and he was one of them, Walter Wriston was a new head of National City Bank, now Citigroup, another. They had decided, we don't need to be aligned with our government anyway. Like, that's fine. They can be there to help us. We can be at the White House. We can go to dinners. We can do all that stuff. Our kids can hang out at Harvard. We can do all that. But we don't have to really be aligned with sort of the sort of national interest from a real individual domestic kind of capacity for citizens of the country. We can do our own thing. Why? Because we have these connections into an oil-rich environment that's making a lot of money. So when there were oil spikes in the 70s, and some of you may remember that situation, and things were very bad here, and interest rates went up, and everything was sort of awful economically, these guys were making like a ton of money because they were the oil profits that were coming out of the Middle East at these spiked levels into debt that they then basically piled on Latin America. So they found this whole way to get out of having to worry about what was happening to the economy in the United States or what was happening to people in the United States or whether they could pay for gas or not or do whatever they needed to do or not. They had this other source of money. And they cultivated that to create a whole more risky environment of which the financial crisis had its initial start. The most recent financial crisis had its initial start. Because that debt to Latin America failed. Those countries couldn't pay the exorbitant rates that these bankers were expecting them to pay, or maybe not even expecting, but wanted them to pay. So they started to fail. So in the 80s, the presidents involved and the Treasury secretaries involved and Congress involved basically bailed out the banks. They called it a Latin American bailout. They called it for the benefit of those countries, but in fact, it was for the benefit of those countries to repay the banks that had lent them the money, which kind of became the whole refrain of what we then saw in the financial crisis. So all of a sudden, what happens? Bankers go from being personally and sort of politically aligned to having their own source of external money to screwing that up completely and totally for many countries in the world, including the United States, and then say, can we be bailed out? And they were under Democratic presidents, they were under Republican presidents. The nature of money, the nature of the banking relationships had zero partisan lines. Like all the stuff we see in elections now and recently, all this sort of partisan platforms and stuff, in the end, the guys with the money don't really care who's in office. Because the way in which they behave is independent. And from the other side as well, the way in which the presidents behave is independent from whatever party they're from, as long as they kind of maintain the relationship with the banking class that they need to maintain a relationship with. So in the 80s, there were bailouts for these bankers for the Latin American catastrophes and Latin American debt. In the 90s, something else happened. These bankers were like, we lost a lot of money and you bailed us out, but we still want to find ways to grow ourselves. So how about, we try to raise more money from our own country, and you basically deregulate us. Because we've exhausted all these other kind of opportunities. I mean, they're still in play, but at the moment they're exhausted. So we need to find ways to really expand now domestically for a moment. And that's what they tended to do. It's like, you screw something up internationally, there's an international crisis, you go back to your domestic base, which is you guys, right, which is our country. You go away, you screw up Mexico, you come back. I mean, it's like this whole cycle of moving risk throughout the world by pure inaccountability. And yet, the ability to be bailed out or helped with legislation to do it again and to do it bigger. And so in the late 1980s, and actually under Ronald Reagan appointed the first Treasury Secretary from Wall Street, who was a man named Don Regan. He had been running Merrill Lynch, which now is part of Bank of America, so it's one of the big six banks. At the time, he was one of the most important CEOs on Wall Street. Reagan had never even met him. He'd funded him some of his campaign money and stuff, but I mean, they never really knew each other. But he had been put up by the Bush family because Merrill Lynch and the Bushes, again, long story, had a very intense, almost century relationship as well. So he became the Treasury Secretary. Under him, a lot of deregulation started to be presented in Congress. And the reason for the deregulation was if American banks have less rules to govern them, they will be able to be competitive, and this was a word that it's every single document in the Senate about this concept, they will be competitive with the world banks, other banks in the world. If we're going to be better than Germany, if Chase is going to be better than Deutsche Bank, we need to do this. None of that legislation really passed under Reagan because of the Latin American crisis. They were busy just trying to help the banks not implode. But by the time it got to Bill Clinton, a lot had happened. So first of all, stuff was in play. And second, Bill Clinton wanted to validate his campaign through the Wall Street community as well, so he wound up appointing a Treasury Secretary named Robert Rubin. Right? Robert Rubin was the co-CEO of Goldman Sachs, where I worked as well after that. He said some of the exact same things that the CEO of Merrill Lynch, Don Regan, had said to Ronald Reagan, which is, for competition purposes, we need our banks to be deregulated. This whole Glass-Steagall thing, it's old, it's antiquated, it doesn't work, it needs to go away or we're never going to be strong as a country. And while that was being discussed, it took a couple years before Glass-Steagall was repealed, before these arguments of Robert Rubin and other people in Congress came into play, which didn't happen until 1999. But all of the years before that, other deregulation happened. And one big deregulation that happened was in the energy sector and the telecom sector, and the fusion of the telecom sector and the energy sector, where companies like Enron started getting into broadband, among all the other things that they were doing. So in 1996, under Clinton, and it wasn't unrelated to these bankers because they were the bankers for these companies. So Goldman Sachs, among others, was a banker and a partner with Enron. And Citigroup was a banker and partner with WorldCom. And so all of these companies that imploded in 2001, 2002 had pushed for deregulation in the mid-90s and achieved it in 1996. And once they achieved it, they went into all sorts of overdrive, not trying to democratize grids, but to basically consolidate their power over power. And that's what they wound up doing. They did it on the financial basis by faking and trading around what they really had. They did it in a manipulative aspect with respect to electricity. They hid stuff off books. They had creative accounting going on throughout everything, and they imploded. And Enron was considered this sort of poster child for energy fraud. But the fraud could not have been committed had the deregulation not happened. I mean, some other kind of fraud might have been committed. But the level and the extent for which a company that was effectively working in financial assets but acting like an energy company on the outside, that could not have happened if it had been regulated much better. And all of the companies, many of which, Enron died and didn't come back, right? But many of the other companies at the time, Reliant, different companies that were involved with the same kinds of fraud, the same kinds of fines during that period of time in the early 2000s, they came back, they just renamed themselves other things. You know, it's like you go bankrupt, you pay a bunch of fines, you do a couple settlements, and you sort of resurrect because the deregulation has not changed. The ability of certain companies to do what they did has not changed. And banking, the deregulation happened in 1999. In 1999, these big banks became bigger. So JP Morgan and Chase became JP Morgan Chase. So Citigroup, or Citibank, merged with Salomon Brothers, which was an investment bank doing like weirdo things and risky or complex things, and Travelers Insurance, and it basically just took all these things, created this financial supermarket, and became dangerous. They lost a lot of money with Enron. They lost a lot of money when the energy sector imploded financially and when the telecom sector imploded financially. And then they said, well, what do we do next? And next was housing. It's like, okay, we imploded. The Federal Reserve now has fixed that by giving us the ability to access money more cheaply because they cut rates after Enron imploded. We're just going to use those to do something else. So what do? We do subprime mortgages. We do mortgages. We repackage them. We create these toxic pyramids of securities, and we go and sell them throughout the world. And we also act as the banker throughout the world, so we actually lend money to countries and communities to borrow in order to buy this stuff that has no value. So we create this whole cascade of problems, and that's how the financial crisis started, none of which has changed. The only thing that's changed is that the banks are like, we're not going to do subprime anymore. There's like, we kind of tapped that out. Or at least we're not going to do subprime mortgages. We're going to do something else. So now there's other things. There's all sorts of credit card things that are going on that are a little sort of weirder than they used to be. There's subprime autos. There's corporate loans to other countries. So the same stuff that happened in the 80s with debt to other countries is just happening now with corporate debt to other countries. So that they kind of always retreat and sort of move geographically and then sort of find that new business that no one's looking at that particular moment. Because what has happened is legislation tends to be really, really behind what's actually going on. And so when things implode, it's like, oh my God, how did that happen? And it's like, well, look, if someone tells you you have a whole pile of money and you can do whatever you want with it, and if you run into trouble, we will just give you more. It doesn't really work. If you tell a bunch of large utilities or large energy companies, look, you have all of this room to consolidate, to take over other companies, to grow yourselves across states, across communities, internationally, which is the other thing that's happening now. There's a lot of mergers internationally in the energy space. Then we're just going to do that. And if there's risks to it, we'll just get bailed out. And that's kind of what's happened. The lightens all of that, which is a good thing to take advantage of for people here and for those of us who actually care about what's happening on the ground, below the ground, and in the sky, is that one of the places these banks are going is to sustainable energy projects. Now, it is not necessarily just because they love the earth. And there's a couple things that, I mean, there are some concurrent things that have happened. Oil prices, for example, have dropped. So Goldman Sachs, which was one of the big oil traders throughout the years, in fact, very involved in Enron. When I was working at Goldman before I stopped after 9/11, there was, I actually had research that I shared on Enron's website on derivatives. I mean, that's how connected it came down. That's how connected the companies were before the implosion happened. They were partners and they were adversaries. But trading energy was part of the big way that Goldman made money in those particular years. It was one of the big things that enabled them to become the powerhouse more recently. They've always been a political powerhouse, but more recently. The guys that run the firm now, Lloyd Blankfein, who is the CEO and chairman, and Gary Cohn, who is my boss's boss, who is the number 2, these were energy guys. These were guys trading with all of these companies, guys looking at natural gas. These were guys that were basically in the pits of those types of commodities, and that's how they looked at them, as commodities, as things to trade. When 9/11 happened, when I was down on Wall Street, I was at Goldman, and when the planes came across and there was smoke everywhere and ticker tape everywhere and nobody knew what was going on, Gary Cohn's group was being told to stay at their desks and make markets. Because and to be fair, we didn't know it was a terrorist attack at that precise moment. But what was known was planes were involved. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty, and no one really knew what had happened. And oil was involved. And so if you are running one of the largest oil trading desks in the world, you don't want to miss anything. Right? So this is the person who is now the number 2 in the company. The company itself has just, the end of last year, announced that it is very cognizant of climate change, that it understands the scientific evidence, and that it is going to invest $150 billion over the next 10 years in sustainable energy projects. And that's good. Now they might have ulterior. I don't say a lot of good things about them, but there might be ulterior motives. They went up from $40 billion. Initially, they had allocated $40 billion before 2014. When oil prices started to come down, they raised the $40 billion to $150 billion. So there are reasons, I believe, that these extra monies are coming in. But it also has to do with, and this is a positive element of this whole story, because I do believe banks need to be broken up. I do believe we need to reinstate Glass-Steagall. We need to divide, right? Because we need to divide our risk from their risk, quite simply. And Dodd-Frank, the act that was passed in the wake of the financial crisis, just simply does not do that. I mean, it's better than not having it passed, but it doesn't do that. The big 6 banks are still bigger today than they were before the crisis. They have 42% more deposits collectively. They have 82% more assets between the 6 of them since the crisis. They are bigger. And they do pose risk. But they also have been refocusing their funding engines to sustainable energy, to clean energy. Wells Fargo has said recently, one of the big 6, Wells Fargo has said recently that they will reduce their lending to coal-related companies. Morgan Stanley has said they will reduce their banking services, their investment banking services to coal, or that they will at least examine the impact of that. So those are 3 of them. Citigroup has also announced that they are investing on a global basis in sustainable energy. And the World Bank and the IMF have done something very interesting as well. And this is sort of the final piece of what I wanted to talk to you about, taking this global. I just came back from a few weeks in Brazil, where I was talking with various people in what is now the old government. I don't know how much you know about what's happening in Brazil, but there's a lot of political stuff going on there. But one of the people I spoke with, who is now the former International Affairs Minister, he was the International Affairs Minister, was involved in a new development bank, which is called the New Development Bank, which is a coordinated effort from what's called BRICS countries. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that were not involved in the initial creation or really hold the power within the IMF and the World Bank in terms of international development projects and financing and deciding who gets what. They created their own. And so one of the things he told me, and you can see it if you look at their logo is a green sort of tri-circular, very light kind of geometrical thing. I don't know what that is in math, but it actually moves and it's light on different websites or when you look at it up, so New Development Bank. And it's the other name for this BRICS bank. And one of the things that's in their mission statement, in their initial mission statement, and they only have $25 billion to start with, but that each country pledged $5 billion of these 5, was that they will be looking for development projects that are of the clean energy, of the renewable type. And the 5 countries involved, it's like one will have a development project in wind, one will have a development project in solar, one will have a development project in water. And so everything they're choosing by mission, from the get-go, they are choosing to do this. And it's a specific choice. And unlike the World Bank and the IMF, they will not try to impose sort of austerity or other measures to these countries in return for the funding. It will simply because that funding helps those projects which help the world. And help the environment and help the earth. And that's their mission. And I'm going actually to China next month to speak with one of the 5 heads of this group. It's located, the headquarters are in Shanghai. And the VP from Brazil, now lives in Shanghai. And we're going to talk. And one of the things I actually tweeted him today in the sort of inter-message tweet thing is about what's happening here. Because there's such a connection on the good, on the positive, between where there is financeability, right, where there's an economic will, and there's also an environmental will, and there's also an equity will to getting stuff done that's important for everyone. And that's important for our environment, that recognizes climate change, that recognizes the need for sustainability, and to finance sustainability. That it doesn't, it is something that can happen from the ground up, from people here and on the ground up, and it is something that some countries are also thinking about doing for developing the larger, more expensive infrastructure going forward. And so one of the things I want to tell him when I go is just the stuff that's going on here, as well. I mean, solar things, from the small to sort of solar installations and new ways of doing that on houses, to the small, sort of juice your iPhone, to whatever it is, that there's such innovation, there's such a necessity, and there's such inspiration, not just from here, but just from people who actually care and are actually doing something about it. So the financing that could come from the large banks, that's great. It could be around now. It is something to tap into. Where it has ulterior motives, it's like we have to play the time card. In case that changes. But it's also important to note that also on the larger level, for the first time, there are development banks that are specifically looking at this issue and only this issue in terms of how they decide which projects they do. And it is because of the NDB that the IMF in this December, added to their mission statement that they consider the best way to add the government work and the private work and the workers' work together is through looking at sustainable energy and is through looking at clean energy. So one person, one organization, one vision actually does have the ability to sort of fight against the more entrenched, more relationship, more long-term alliances on the sort of upper echelon of politics and finance and really get something done. So I don't say that about a lot of different sectors. I don't say that about the finance sector. It needs a severe, cosmetic alteration on so many levels, and it needs, the people who are CEOs now should not be CEOs now. Jamie Dimon should not have that job. Lloyd Blankfein should not have that job. There should be people who weren't involved in spending so much of our country's time and money and confidence in the way that they did, still running these institutions. And these institutions shouldn't be allowed to have our depositors, insurance, and lots of other things. But if they're able to finance solid renewable energy type of sustainable energy projects, then, okay, that is something that we'll take for now. And if development banks can move other development banks to want to do the same kinds of projects, it's something to take advantage of now. Already in jobs, solar, sustainable energy jobs are outpacing other jobs. There's stuff that's happening from the ground up here, as we know here, as we heard last night. And this is something that's happening on a global basis. And oftentimes people in power will run kicking and screaming from keeping their power, but if we can make what they do, or at least throw into their arsenal what what we want for the earth, what we want for ourselves, then we can, continue to get something done and move this thing forward. As JFK said, in the end, we all breathe the same air, and that's true. And that's something that I think will motivate us going forward, and will sort of create the positive energy that will fight against sort of all the glut of the negative that continues to be there, but that hopefully we can sort of wash away with what's happening here and what some of these organizations and individuals and countries want to do going forward. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. I think we have time for questions.
Check. Do you have a question? We have a couple of microphones here in the center. There's one in the back too, so orderly lines. We do have time for a few questions, so we'll start here.
Can you comment on the Deutsche Bank and their exposure to derivatives and how the negative interest rates will affect that?
Yeah, Deutsche Bank, the largest bank in Germany, talk about having our consolidation of the big six. Deutsche Bank is like the bank in Germany. It has a lot of derivatives or complex security exposure, as it does to banks here. The thing with banks is that they're all codependent. When one fails badly, it tends to take down the system, which is what we saw, which is why the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank are on 0 to negative rates. They're continuing to fuel these institutions. Effectively, it's like when you're off on your credit card. If you can keep getting money cheap, you can keep on either raising debt or, in their case, keeping their derivatives books going. So it is a danger, and low in interest rates being negative just pushes that danger forward. It does not fix any problem.
Question in the back microphone.
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. How would you perceive blockchain changing the finance paradigm?
My thing with blockchain and with digital currency is that conceptually, I do like the idea of having a more democratic, currency than the dollar, because that has a political, obviously, overtone to it. I don't really trust it, though, personally. I think it's not actually democratic or open enough for me to feel secure in working with it. And I know there's some different positions on that, but I personally don't trust. I trust the idea of it. The current execution of it, I question.
As compared to big banks?
Sorry?
As compared to big banks?
No. Look, I think big banks should be more regulated. I think blockchain should be more regulated. Yeah, I just where it's currently at.
Speaking of Goldman Sachs, do you think they give a couple $100,000 to an ex-senator for nothing?
Yeah, so Hillary Clinton obviously has gotten some money from Goldman over the time. As I said, the former Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, who helped architect the deletion of Glass-Steagall, the repeal, which is why we're kind of at where we are today, why Goldman Sachs is opening the ability for people to have bank accounts with them, even though it doesn't actually care about real people, can you hear me? Oh. Sorry. No, I was just saying, so just to quicken that. So Robert Rubin, again, was Treasury Secretary to Bill Clinton when the repeal of Glass-Steagall happened. One of the things that allowed was all this complexity and all this risk to be excreted from Wall Street. And Hillary Clinton was a beneficiary of those relationships when she became senator and when she was also renominated and got to become senator the second time. There are all sorts of established relationships between her and Goldman. Goldman doesn't do things for free. Goldman wouldn't even raise the sort of salary of its secretaries in the 2001 year as opposed to taking it from them when they had a bad year. It doesn't do things just for the sheer hell of it. And with Hillary Clinton, if she becomes president, I don't believe anything will change for Goldman Sachs. It's, I love Bernie. So
So how do we get the banker?
and Bernie, by the way, was one of the only 9 senators who voted against the repeal of Glass-Steagall during the first Clinton. He's been very consistent and measured about why that was a bad thing to do and what has been caused because of it.
So how do we get the banker control out of our government then? Do you advocate eliminating the Fed, or what steps can the government take? Do you have any proposals for all these problems you've identified?
Well, one thing, and again, this is something that has to continue to be pushed. I mean, bringing back a Glass-Steagall and reducing, and there was another act that was passed in 1994 under Clinton that allowed banks to go over state lines to increase their capacity for deposits. And so what happened was they were supposed to only have 10%, any one bank, of all of the deposits. And some of them are kind of above that, some are below that, but because they also have so much derivatives and other risk, 6 banks have 95% of the trading assets in the country. And so when this law was put in place to give a 10% cap but allow them to do whatever they wanted up to that cap, it didn't think about the actual risk, the actual trading risk, the derivatives risks. So those two things on a big basis need to be done. You need to basically break them up on the basis of their risk and their deposits and separate the two. So you need to basically bring back Glass-Steagall, and you need to have caps, limits as to how much risk of the system, even from a trading perspective, they can have. Because even if they are separated, if they still control too much of it, that's still going to be a problem. And also bringing stuff from the ground up. I mean, just like trying to get off of the official grids and doing things from an energy perspective that are more democratic, more isolated, more individualistic, more community-based, that can be done also in finance. It can be done with credit unions, it can be done with community banks, it can be done with like B2B type of lending, that actually looks at the sort of long-term nature of where that finance goes, whether that's to individuals in the community, whether that's to projects that make sense and work towards the future. And so I think it's a lot, as I was saying, these are century-long relationships, some of the stuff at the top. But from the bottom as well, I think there's stuff you can do, is sort of take the power from the bottom out, and sort of leave whatever's going on up there and also fight on the top.
You went to great lengths, and I laud you for this, pointing out that the heads of speculative finance are largely greedy, irresponsible fools and idiots. I think there's a danger of them using their ill-gotten gains, huge ill-gotten gains, to take over the gains we've had in renewable energy that have been so hardly fought for, and I'm wondering about your dangers.
And that's why, again, that's a good question. That's why there's this sort of double-edged, I'm a little cynical about this whole $150 billion up from 40 from Goldman and other large banks to clean energy. They recognize it, which is good, as sort of actual democratic power, alternative power in the future, and they want to have control over it. And the best way to control things that are developing is to finance them, because then you have a tie on it. It's like I'm going to finance all the solar installations in some area or in some country or in some state. Okay, well now I'm going to get a percentage of returns on them. So now I get to have decisions as to how they get allocated or how they grow. So there's a cost to money. From some of these institutions, and the way to sort of keep from that is, again, to try and be as much as possible on a sort of more outside of that system, or at least sharing with the system and outside of the system, to getting financing to projects that we maintain more control on from the bottom, and that you sort of work together through a community and a state and localities to maintain that control. And it's hard. I mean, it's a hard fight, but what else are we going to do?
Would you please discuss the currency practices before the greenback as described in A Nation of Counterfeiters by Stephen Min, and their influence on behavior leading up to the Federal Reserve Bank and afterwards?
I mean, that's a long question, but what I'll say, and I'm not familiar specifically with his work, but one of the things that happened, this goes back to North versus South and the Union versus the Confederacy, and where America wanted to see itself relative to Europe as a rising superpower, which then it took through World War I to really to become. The idea of the greenback, the idea of being able to print money versus to have physical money means that whatever the central banking institution is that can print that money, that can create that money in an emergency, does have power. It has power to plaster over the emergency, but it also has power to create the risk that created that emergency to begin with. And the thing with greenbacks, the thing with the dollar, the thing with paper money is that it's not actual paper money. It's not $1 in exchange for sort of one piece of the Federal Reserve's book. It is some dollars and a multi-trillion-dollar book of toxic securities that the Federal Reserve still owns from the banks in the residue of the financial crisis. So there isn't a dollar in, dollar out. And the more that you can have a paper or sort of a currency that's fictitious to an extent, that doesn't have something real backing it, the more you have the propensity towards risk. And you also have the propensity to artificially grow, which is why it happens. And you also have the propensity to grow a book. The Federal Reserve grew its book by trillions of dollars by being able to also flood the system with cheap money, which mostly goes to the banks. It doesn't come to us till way later or never.